Hey everybody, this is Chapter 4 of Part 4 of Charles Bettelheim's Class Struggles in the USSR, Part uh, third. Jesus Christ. Every single time I go to read the title of this book, I embarrass myself. Class Struggles in the USSR, Third Period, 1930 to 1941, Part 1, The Dominated, by Charles Bettelheim. Part 4 of the book is titled Capital and Capital's Crises. Chapter 4 of Part 4 is titled Crises of Overaccumulation and Domination of Capital. Alright, so here we go. The economic crisis which we have just described were the result the economic crises which have just been described were the result of an accumulation which was an end of itself and which did not aim at satisfying concrete needs for consumption and production. Such crises are capitalist crises. They are tied to the reproduction specific circumstances of the relationship of exploitation that take the basic form of the wage relationship. In the circumstances of the Soviet economy in the 1930s, the contradictions engendered by the class struggle in production and distribution gave rise to open crises of surplus accumulation of capital, taking the inverted shape of surplus production crises of Western capitalism, namely the shape of a shortage of goods which becomes a situation of general shortage. In 1933, crisis is a very good illustration. The 1933 crisis is a very good illustration of the particular features of this type of crisis because it was marked by extremely serious shortages which involved certain means of production, consumer goods, and particularly food items, above all grains. This latter shortage resulted in the famine of 1933. The famine was simultaneously the result of a policy and the manifestation of a crisis tied to surplus accumulation, which led to an excessive procurement of grain intended to be sold in a world market to pay for equipment. This same surplus accumulation led to a substantial drainage of labor from agriculture and to many other charges on the material resources of the countryside for the benefit of accumulation and industrialization. Footnote. Thus the Soviet industrialization of the 1930s brought to the peasants of the USSR dramatic consequences analogous to those that a British industrialization in the 18th and early 19th centuries brought to the Irish and Indian peasants who were condemned by the million to famine. End footnote. From the concrete analysis of the crises of the 1930s, an attempt can be made at producing a general model for the crises of the Soviet economy. Under Stalin, accumulation for the sake of accumulation benefited those sectors where the capitalist relationships were most developed in those industries producing new equipment, that is, new means of exploitation. It developed to the point of preventing the enlarged reproduction of agriculture, of reducing the production of the latter, and finally of blocking for a period the stable continuation of industrial accumulation. The surplus accumulation of the years 1928 to 32 for a time made increased production of surplus value impossible, because the surplus accumulation of the years 1928 to 32 temporarily prohibited an increase of employment and of labor productivity. The increase of the rate of accumulation that was supposed to permit the accumulation process to continue on a larger scale resulted, contrarily, in prohibiting the continuation of this process. The quote, means, end quote, that were set to work thus came into contradiction with their own ends, this being a characteristic process of surplus accumulation. The quote, means that were set to work thus came into contradiction with those means' own ends, this being a characteristic process of surplus accumulation. In 1933, the surplus production of capital had a definite, quote, absolute, end quote, character, parenthesis, in the sense that Marx gave to this term, in parenthesis. It was at that time impossible to obtain a greater mass of surplus value, either by an immediate increase in the number of wage earners or by raising still more the exploitation rate of those already occupied in production. As has been seen, the various, quote, shortages, end quote, prevented the immediate continuation of the process of draining away designated labor forces from the countryside and were an obstacle to a rapid growth of labor productivity. Consequently, the process of industrialization was temporarily held back. The construction sites and factories could not receive sufficient workers, equipment, and means of production. Delays in construction and operation were consequently substantially lengthened, and part of capital previously accumulated was, quote, put to sleep, end quote. The construction sites and factories could not receive sufficient workers, equipment, and means of production. Delays in construction, equipment, and means of production. Delays in construction and operation were consequently substantially lengthened, and part of capital previously accumulated was, quote, put to sleep, end quote. Circumstances were such that certain factories had to slow down those factories' operations so that other factories, serving more directly the accumulation of new means of work, could continue to function. Quote, putting to sleep, end quote, some of the factories and construction sites increased the shortages which were hitting consumers. It did this directly when it entailed the non-supply of products necessary to cover the needs of consumers. It did it indirectly with a multiplier effect by causing, parenthesis, by the poor supplying of production units, in parenthesis, irregular operation of factories. Thus the shortages became general and an increasing slice of investment was frozen, while the velocity of social capital circulation was slowed down. From 1934, the intensity of the crisis eased little by little. The crisis disappeared thanks to progressive clearing of bottlenecks resulting from reallocation of labor forces. This allowed certain factories to increase production and certain construction works to be completed. The 1937 crisis developed basically in the same conditions as the preceding crisis, with the relative importance of shortages moving from agriculture to industry to such an extent that during more than 3 years, from 1937 to 1940, productive investment was below the level of 1936. New section. Section 1. The specific nature of the, quote, Soviet, end quote, economic crises of the 1930s. There can be no question within the framework of the present study of attempting to present a detailed analysis of capitalist crises in their various specific forms. On the other hand, it is necessary to make several observations about the crises experienced by, quote, Western, end quote, countries so as to better illuminate the capitalist character of the, quote, Soviet, end quote, crises of the 1930s as well as their specific features. At first, it must be underlined that the economic crises of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism themselves took several different forms. For example, during the 19th century, economic crises manifested themselves predominantly by falls in prices, and only affected the volume of production to a small extent. On the other hand, in the 20th century, with the development of monopolies and oligopolies, these characteristics were reversed. The main aspect of a crisis is the collapse of production, the investment and employment, while prices do not fall, or since World War II, may even rise substantially, engendering the phenomenon known as stagflation. On the other hand, in the 20th century, with the development of monopolies and oligopolies, these characteristics were reversed. The main aspect of a crisis is the collapse of production, investment, and employment, while prices do not fall, or since World War II, many even rise substantially, engendering the phenomenon known as stagflation. Pointing out these particular features of the different economic crises of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism does not exhaust the subject of their specific forms. In a way which here can only be descriptive A distinction should in fact be made between crises whose apparent decisive element is, quote, market saturation, end quote, for consumer goods, parenthesis, and which therefore begin with a, quote, overproduction, end quote, of these goods, paralyzing part of the productive structure and leading to a, quote, general overproduction, end quote, and crises whose apparently decisive element is the fall of profit rates, which brings about a reduction of investment, the closing of a growing number of factories, unemployment, quote, underconsumption, end quote, etc. In reality, these two manifestations of the crisis are inseparable. For the, quote, tendency toward a lower profit rate, end quote, and the, quote, tendency towards overproduction, end quote, are intimately linked. Footnote. This might be a footnote that I missed. The term, quote, Western capitalism, end quote, conveniently designates the various forms of capitalism characterized by the predominance of legal private ownership of the means of production and relatively limited state interference with the process of accumulation, the distribution of investment. End footnote. These crises mark, quote, the crash of normal conditions of reproduction, a temporary failure of regulation by the law of value, end quote. More deeply, another distinction must be made between two types of crises. On the one hand, there are the crises which it is possible to, quote, emerge. On the one hand, there are those crises from which it is possible to, quote, emerge, while returning to the same regime of accumulation and the same mode of regulation as before the crisis. These are the, quote, small crises, end quote. On the other hand, there are those from which it is not possible to emerge except by a change of the regime of accumulation and the mode of regulation. These are the, quote, great crises, end quote, marked by especially acute manifestations of resistance to capital exploitation by those subjected to it. Footnote. On these various points, see above pages, which is a reference to an article by A. Lippietz, Les doubles complexités de la crise, which I guess is like the double complexity of the crisis. I don't know. Anyway, sorry, just fucking forget this footnote. Anyway, here we are interested only in the, quote, small crises, end quote, which manifest themselves as crises of, quote, underconsumption, end quote. Because the, quote, Soviet, end quote, crises of 1933 and 1937 were also, quote, small crises, end quote. During the phase which precedes and prepares the ground for such crises in, quote, Western capitalism, those who direct the process of production and reproduction struggle to obtain the maximum value from the part of capital that they control, and to accumulate as much as possible within the limits imposed on them by the global reproduction of the conditions of production. This tendency toward maximum accumulation is the form taken by the class struggle in production. It tends to bring an increasing subjection of living labor to dead labor, and to lead to the expropriation of the workers, whose knowledge is more and more incorporated into the automatic system of machines. In the short term, the class struggle in production is portrayed as, quote, the requirements of competition, end quote. In reality, this latter, according to Marx's formula, only, quote, carried out the immanent laws of capital, end quote, laws which are imposed on individual capital. The struggle in which the agents of capital are engaged in this way has as a consequence at certain times an increase of accumulation and employment at such a rhythm that the demand for labor power grows rapidly, leading to a certain raising of nominal wages and of real wages. This contributes especially to increase the demand for consumer goods more rapidly than their supply increases, and brings a rise of prices for these goods, allowing capital operating in Section 2, which produces consumer goods, to take a relatively large fraction than previously of surplus value. Consequently, investment in this section increases more rapidly. However, the raising of wages impels capitalists as a group to adopt techniques characterized by a higher capital content, which tends to reduce the average rate of profit, and the rhythms at which the invested capital and employment increase. These tendencies make themselves felt more or less at the same time that an increase in the supply of consumer goods occurs, thanks to the accumulation previously achieved in Section 2. In such conditions, part of the consumer goods arriving on the market have more difficulty finding a taker. This is a sign of, quote, overproduction of goods, end quote. The overproduction of goods and the reduction of the profit rate bring about a fall in accumulation and thereby a fall in demand for means of production, and hence a slackening of activity in Section 1, the means of production department, which reduces the means of production. From this point, the crisis spreads and takes the form of general overproduction. Let us now see what happens in, quote, Soviet, end quote, conditions, where state ownership and state planning occupy a privileged position. In these conditions, the class struggle in production is strengthened by the action of state departments intervening so as to bring about maximal accumulation and priority development of Section 1, the means of production department. Footnote: concrete analysis of the process of accumulation illuminates how in the Soviet economy the process of reproduction had always been governed by the immanent laws of capitalism. Thus it is of little importance that at the level of the, quote, consciousness, end quote, of the agents of reproduction, the decisions taken seem to be dictated not by these laws, which act independently of individuals' consciousness, but by a mixture of empirically identified objective constraints and, quote, requirements, labeled by official ideology as, quote, requirements for the building of socialism, end quote. In Volume 4, we shall examine what, in Soviet conditions, are the ideological forms under which the process of enlarged reproduction is, quote, grasped, end quote, and through which take place some of the interventions by various state departments. End footnote. This form of imposition of the immanent laws of capital brings about deep changes in the process of the maturing and bursting out of crises. We shall look at just a few of the transformations, those which involve important consequences and which seemed especially noticeable during the 1930s. Firstly, we note that during these years the periods of rising accumulation are marked by a rise of nominal wages, but also by a stagnation and sometimes even a lowering of real wages. In fact, in the absence of an increase in the supply of consumer goods, an increase blocked by state intervention, the increase of employment and of nominal wages makes retail prices rise substantially, and this in spite of all the talk about price stability. We also note that the measures taken concerning wholesale prices are, on the other hand, sufficient to ensure that sales made by production units in Section 2 are at a relatively low price. In these circumstances, rises of retail prices do not increase the financial resources available to Section 2, but increase the fiscal receipts of the budget. These increased receipts then serve to increase investment in Section 1. This is an important difference, compared to, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism, in the distribution of accumulation funds during the period of upward movement. This change has remarkable effects. The relative slowing down of accumulation of Section 2 puts a brake on an increase of production goods in this section. Consequently, there is not a tendency towards overproduction of consumer goods, but, on the contrary, a tendency towards shortage of this kind of goods. This tendency is strongly manifested under the particular form it adopts in Soviet conditions, the tendency of capital to accumulate for the sake of accumulation. If the, quote, efficiency, end quote, of a given form of capitalism is evaluated not according to the improvement it allows in the living conditions of workers, such an improvement not being the goal of capitalist accumulation, but according to its capacity to increase the rate of accumulation, it can be said that Soviet-type capitalism is more, quote, efficient, end quote, than any other. Footnote. According to the estimates of G. Grossman, net investment in 1937 was 21% of the national product in military expenses, appearing in the budget. 9%. See the contribution by the author to A. Bergson's edited volume, Soviet Economic Growth. by that author, G. Grossman, to A. Bergson's edited volume Soviet Economic Growth. It will be noted that according to N. Kaplan, the investment rate as a proportion of gross national product was for the USA in 1937 and 1940 respectively 14.2 and 15%. Parenthesis above, page 42, table 2.2. Column 5. A rate clearly lower than that of the USSR. End footnote. This efficiency, moreover, has nothing to do with, quote, planning, end quote, parenthesis, since the plans are far from being strictly followed, end parenthesis. It results above all from a domination, almost unlimited, of capital. This domination is achieved through a number of circumstances, in particular by a firm centralization of the administration of capital by the state, and by the paralysis inflicted on the social forces that might attempt to limit the exacerbation of the accumulation process. This paralysis results from the destruction, pushed as far as possible in the Stalin epoch, of all forms of organization and expression which would allow these forces to intervene in a coherent way in the life of society. The essential role played by the practice that has just been mentioned in the exacerbation of the process of accumulation is corroborated by the fact that even when the plans, quote, forecast, end quote, as happened several times after World War II, a faster development of Section 2 than Section 1, in practice they were not observed. The priority, in fact, remained with accumulation in Section 1, and it was only exceptionally that Section 2 developed as fast as had been, quote, forecast, end quote, by the plans. Only economic and social crises can temporarily interrupt the priority development of accumulation and of Section 1. In this way, the unprecedented objective force favoring accumulation of capital manifests itself unprecedented as soon as the power of capital merges with the power of the state, and the workers are deprived of the possibility of organizing themselves in an autonomous way to put up resistance to the tendency towards maximal accumulation. Secondly, it will be noted that the specific forms of economic crises which characterize, quote, Soviet, end quote, capitalism are connected with the fact that the priority given to accumulation in Section 1, the means of production department, creates obstacles to the adoption of Section 2, of techniques which would allow the section to experience rapid increase, Section 2 being means of consumption department, of techniques which would allow that section to experience a rapid increase of labor productivity. Hence there is an aggravation of the manpower shortage. In the circumstances that have just been described, the pursuit during a certain period of substantial accumulation inevitably brings on a combination of two shortages, that of consumer goods and that of means of production. At an earlier moment, the development of these shortages tends to exacerbate, and one can see this especially at the beginning of the 1930s, the accumulation effort, because the authorities, the planners, and the administrators strive to, quote, overcome the shortages by investing even more, end quote. The supplementary investment effort only makes shortages worse, multiplies bottlenecks, paralyzes factories and construction sites. Thus, in 1932, the movement toward extension of accumulation was held back, and this coincided with the beginning of a crisis. The slowdown of accumulation continued until part of the investment made previously came to maturity. At this point, the putting into operation of more productive means of production, installed thanks to those investments, permitted the, quote, liberation, end quote, of labor forces, the easing of shortages, and the resumed increase of the mass of surplus value obtained and invested. Such are briefly some of the specific features of the, quote, Soviet economic crises, which took place during the 1930s. In the main, these features are also found in the post-war crises because the social and political relationships that were established in the 1930s still remain fundamentally the same. Footnote: it will be noted that on each occasion when social and political relationships like those in the USSR from 1930 are dominant, there are accumulation crises of the same type, marked by a very substantial rise in accumulation and general shortages of production. Poland in the 1970s is an outstanding example. Here accumulation reached a rate of 30 to 35% of the national income. This last figure could well be a, quote, world record, end quote. While serious shortages developed, On these various points, the interview given by the Polish economist C. Bobrowski to Le Nouvel Observateur of July 11, 1981, is very useful. End footnote. As a last remark on these questions, it should be emphasized that the real specificity of, quote, Soviet, end quote, economic crisis is the fact that the blockage of the reproduction process results from an absolute overproduction of capital, whose particular features we shall analyze shortly. As a last remark on these questions, it should be emphasized that the real specificity of, quote, Soviet, end quote, economic crisis is the fact that the blockage of the reproduction process results from an absolute overproduction of capital. Whose particular features we shall analyze shortly. As for the generalization of shortages, this results not only from overaccumulation bringing such crises to maturity, but also from the relative efficiency of the control exercised on prices. In fact, thanks to this control, the generalization of shortages does not provoke an open, brutal and global price increase that could reduce wages sorry, there's a typo in here. It says reduce or wages. I don't know. I think it's a typo. Anyway, I'm going to say what I think it says. In fact, thanks to this control, the generalization of shortages does not provoke an open, brutal, and global price increase that could reduce wages and the monetary receipts of enterprises. In this matter, the particularities of, quote, Soviet crises seem to be tied to a specific combination of overaccumulation and, quote, repressed, end quote, inflation. One other feature must also be noted. State ownership and planning permit the continuation of what Marx called, quote, bourgeois ownership, end quote. Parenthesis, even though, in a formal sense, this has been abolished, in parenthesis. The ownership, in fact, has nothing in common with what is usually called, quote, private ownership, end quote, of the means of production, which is only legal private ownership. Now, bourgeois or capitalist ownership is constituted by the sum of social relationships which allow the exploitation of wage labor. Marx rightly condemned the juridical abstract usage of the category of ownership when he criticized the way in which Proudhon had recourse to this category. Thus, Marx wrote, ownership constitutes, finally, the supreme category in M. Proudhon's system. In the real world, the division of labor in all the categories of M. Proudhon are social relationships, whose total forms what today is called ownership. Outside of these relationships, bourgeois ownership is only a metaphysical and juridical illusion. When M. Proudhon presents ownership as an independent relationship, Proudhon commits more than an error of method. Proudhon clearly proves that he has not grasped the chain which binds all the forms of bourgeois production. End quote. Marx. Capital. I think. Maybe that's, I don't know. It says Le Capital. The footnote says Le Capital, Paris, 1967-69, volume 6, page 264 to 65. I don't know, that might be something else than capital. Anyway. State ownership, end quote Marx. State ownership leaves intact the wage relationship of exploitation and simply creates a specific form of capitalist ownership which develops thoroughly with state planning. This development creates conditions that permit the explosion of new forms of crises of overproduction of capital. From the end of the 1920s in the USSR, the conditions which enable an unleashing of economic crisis due to relative overproduction of capital, typical of Western capitalism, were largely eliminated. From the end of the 1920s in the USSR, the conditions which enable an unleashing economic crisis due to relative overproduction of capital, typical of Western capitalism, were largely eliminated, which made possible and inevitable the unleashing of another form of crisis, the increase of absolute overproduction of capital. The crisis of absolute overproduction of capital. This was characterized by the fact that after a certain period of rising investment, the continuation of the accumulation process no longer led to an increase in the mass of surplus value, so much so that the very aim of capitalist production, the putting to good use, parenthesis, quote, valorization, end quote, and parenthesis, of capital, was frustrated and thus made it impossible to continue increasing accumulation. In Book 3 of Capital, Marx deals with this absolute overproduction. In Marx's own terms, absolute overproduction takes place when the increased capital produces only a mass of surplus value more or less equal to, or even less than, it was before its increase. He explains this hypothesis by referring to the case where capital increases in relation to the working population in such proportions that the absolute labor that the population provides cannot be protracted, nor can the relative hours of work be extended. He then shows the principal effect of such absolute overproduction of capital. In the circumstances of, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism of the 19th century, the absolute form of overproduction of capital constitutes a limiting case, since economic crises burst forth well before the realization of its condition of appearance, because in particular of the disproportions, plural, which appear in the different productions, and or of the chain effect of the decrease in profits which strikes certain enterprises. Later, other elements help to ensure that, quote, Western, end quote, capitalism does not experience crises due to absolute overproduction of capital. In fact, the industrialized capitalist countries have recourse more and more to the export of capital to countries where capitalism is less developed, or they import manpower from these same countries. Footnote: it will be noted that these operations of capital export or labor import require that the countries having recourse to them enjoy a sufficiently powerful situation in the world market. Lacking this, they cannot succeed in developing their exports sufficiently, which may impel them to win by force a more advantageous place in the world. This is what happened with Nazi Germany from 1933. As I tried to show in the Économie Allem and Sous et Nazisme in Paris, published in Paris, 1971. End footnote. In the Soviet Union in the 1930s, the limiting case of absolute overproduction of capital became the, quote, normal form, end quote, of the crisis, which explains why it manifested itself by a generalization of shortages, because accumulation was pushed to extremes, as already seen, to the detriment and the disregard of the satisfaction of consumer needs. This type of crisis, which pushes to extremes the tendency toward accumulation for the sake of accumulation, carries to the very limit one of the features of capitalism, the domination of exchange value over use value. Thus, there manifests itself in Soviet capitalism a, quote, indifference to use value, end quote, which tends to spread to the whole economy, with the exception of the military sector and sectors tied to the military sector, parenthesis, for there the survival of the authorities is involved, in parenthesis. Indifference to use value is in some way incorporated in the plan indices, insofar as indifference to use value. Indifference to use value is in some way incorporated in the planned indices, insofar as the plan indices give prime importance to, quote, gross, unquote, value of production, that is, to the quantity of money which this production is held to represent. The quantity of money which this production is held to represent. Quote, the race for quantity, end quote, therefore becomes basic. New section, section 2. The substitution of the apparent domination of the plan for the apparent domination of competition. Examination of Soviet economic crises illustrates the circumstance that neither state intervention through the plans, nor the existence of state ownership, nor the claimed, quote, new class content, end quote, of the authorities after they had been taken over by the Bolshevik Party, quote, abolished, end quote, the laws of capitalist movement which result from the dominant role played by the wage relationship of exploitation and the forms of class struggle that are engendered by the reproduction of that relationship. These laws were still those of capitalism. However, the way in which they manifested themselves was transformed thanks to the upheavals affecting the, quote, forms of competition, end quote. Footnote. In a paper delivered in Tokyo in 1979, Paul Sweezy advanced formulations that are very close to those expressed here, although Sweezy was not discussing the Soviet economy. In fact, after having noted that under capitalism the specific form of extracting surplus labor is the capital-wage-labor relationship, Sweezy added that the transformation of competitive capitalism into monopoly capitalism not only does not abolish the relationship, but refines and perfects it. See Monthly Review, May 1981, page 11. Paul Sweezy follows this remark with other very interesting observations on the changing forms of competition. The changing forms of competition, on the actions these changing forms bear, on the process of accumulation, the amount of surplus value extracted, and that surplus value's utilization. In my opinion, these observations apply very pertinently to the Soviet economy. End footnote. To grasp the permanence of the competition that hides behind the variety of its forms, it is necessary to put aside the superficial concepts that lead to a purely negative definition of competition, making it the equivalent of a collective of, quote, making it the equivalent of a collection of, quote, absences, end quote. Absence of monopoly, absence of regulation, absence of state intervention, etc. The negative definitions must therefore be replaced by a positive definition, which shows that competition is a product of struggle between the different fragments of social capital. The negative definition must therefore be replaced by a positive definition, which shows that competition is a product of struggle between different fragments of social capital. Several points must be emphasized here. 1. The struggle relationship between the different fragments of social capital is inherent in the very existence of social capital, which always takes the form of separate capitals. This separation of the different fragments of capital necessarily stems from the wage relationship, from the fundamental separation of the direct producers from their means of production. This separation of the different fragments of capital necessarily stems from the wage relationship and the fundamental separation of the direct producers from their means of production. The latter entails the separation of the different processes of production through which operates the reproduction of social capital, which therefore takes the form of the reproduction of multiple conflicting capitals. In the Soviet economy, the separation of the different processes of production and of the different fragments of social capital manifests itself by the multiplicity of enterprises which in no way constitute a, quote, unique state trust, end quote, as imagined at first by various Soviet theoreticians, including Bukharin. The necessary separation of the different fragments of social capital had the consequence that despite state ownership and planning, there exists commodity production, and accordingly the contradictions and illusions inseparable from this form of reproduction. 1 second. Two, the struggle between different fragments of social capital was essentially a struggle for the appropriation and accumulation of the largest possible fraction of surplus value. In the Soviet economy, this shows itself especially by the demand for investment credit and allocations of means of production, which ceaselessly emanate from the various, quote, Soviet, end quote, enterprises and trusts. The accumulation of these demands constantly confuses the plans and contributes to the, quote, inflation, end quote, of their targets. Footnote. The struggle that different enterprises have to put up for investment credit allocation still characterizes, quote, Soviet, end quote, planning. They also characterize countries that have the same kind of planning. Thus, C. Bobrovsky says that the Polish plan of the 1970s was, quote, the result of a permanent struggle of the different lobbies for credits with no consideration for overall cohesion, end quote. End footnote. Three, the struggle between the different fragments of social capital, parenthesis, competition, therefore, in parenthesis, is none other than that which Marx called the, quote, relationship that capital maintains with itself as much as with other capital, end quote. Footnote. See Karl Marx, Principles for a Critique. In the same text a little earlier, Marx writes, quote, by definition, competition is only the interior nature of capital, capital's essential resolution, manifesting itself and being realized as the interaction between numerous capitals, as an external tendency of an internal necessity, parenthesis, capital not existing nor able to exist, except as a plurality of capitals, is in their interaction that its own movement appears, end parenthesis, end quote. Marx. End footnote. 4. In abstract terms, competition is nothing but an internal relationship of capital, which looks like an exterior relationship. Competition is the forms of this. It is the forms of this external relationship, which are transformed by the action of changes affecting the concrete relationships between the different fragments of capital. These modifications give rise to different faces. Quote, free competition, monopolies, state intervention, economic plan, etc. The rise of these forms gives birth to a series of illusions which are taken as, quote, truths, end quote. Thus, the dominance of the form of the plan gives birth to the illusion of a possible, quote, control, end quote, over the economy, and gives body to a new fetishism, that of the plan which comes to be added to the fetishism of the state and the fetishism of money. These fetishisms help to hide the concrete requirements of reproduction and feed the myth of the omnipotence of planning carried out by a state which centralizes and distributes the monetary means of accumulation. The different forms that competition takes are themselves the result of a historic process, the struggle of the development of productive forces and of class struggle. In the Soviet Union, from the end of the 1920s, competition took mainly the form of planning. This form predominated under the joint action of a series of elements which, in particular the massive development of primitive accumulation, strongly centralized following class struggles, which favored a certain form of state ownership, and of the dominance of ideological images, themselves tied to the form of conflicts between capital and the working class, which portrayed state ownership and planning as, quote, the abolition of capitalism, end quote. In these circumstances, the predominance of state ownership and planning complete the domination of capital because they tend to eliminate what Marx called the, quote, legal or extra-economic obstacles restricting the freedom, parenthesis, of capital, in parenthesis, to move between different branches of production, end quote. Marx. Thus, the constraint on accumulation, the immanent law of capital, acts mainly through the plan, which pushes forward maximum accumulation and the priority development of Section 1, or the means of production department. The predominance of the form of state planning transforms the concrete conditions in which are established prices, wages, the rate of surplus value, and the distribution of the rate of surplus value. In the distribution of surplus value, and it tends to hide the conflicts between the different fragments of social capital. Because of this poor visibility, competition is represented objectively, parenthesis, in the sense of a, quote, staging, end quote, or of a Darstellung, end parenthesis, in the guise of competition's imaginary opposite, the unity of social capital. The appearance of the unity of social capital is also that of its, quote, abolition, end quote, inasmuch it is an antagonistic social relationship bearing specific contradictions of the illusion that the state can ensure a, quote, rational distribution, end quote, of the labor force and means of production and a regular growth of productive forces and consumption, an illusion constantly demolished by the real movement, which is that of the contradictions inherent in capitalist production. Hence also the concealment of the objective conditions of price and wage fixing, and the tendency to reduce these social relationships to simple forms that can be, quote, utilized, end quote, as instruments. By, quote, manipulating, end quote, as it does, prices and salaries, Soviet power only makes the economic system more opaque and exacerbates the contradictions of capital. To finish with these remarks, it should be noted, firstly, how much the development of state planning, parenthesis, as it took the form at the end of the 1920s, in parenthesis, strengthened the fetishism of money that dominated those at the top of the state apparatus. The monetary illusion thus impelled the party leadership to pay attention only to the sums of money which are to be invested, taking no account of material shortages. At the end of the 1920s and the beginning of the 1930s, money fetishism led to anticipatory acceptance of the fact that material resources were insufficient for concrete needs. Such an acceptance is explained by a real faith in the, quote, power of money, end quote. As Bukharin said, the party leadership was thus encouraged to believe, quote, that if one had money, one will also have everything else, end quote. Bukharin. Also to be noted are the extraordinary illusions which were born at the same time from the combination of money fetishism, state fetishism, and plan fetishism. It was this combination which led the Soviet economist Stalinism to declare, quote, we are not bound by any parenthesis objective and parenthesis law, ... The question of rhythm is decided by the will of human beings, end quote. It was again this combination of fetishism which led to another Soviet economist, Weisberg, to claim, quote, we are introducing enormous changes in all aspects of human life, and in a revolutionary way, we shall penetrate the forces of nature. End quote. Weisberg. This is the enchanted world which also gave birth to the idea of a curve of economic growth moving upwards and accelerating, with Stalin talking about, quote, rising Bolshevik curves, end quote, as opposed to, quote, falling Trotskyist curves, end quote. Stalin. Report to the 16th Party Congress, June 27, 1930. In footnote. The economic crises reveal the illusory character of all these declarations. However, they are not enough to cause the disappearance of the fetishisms of money, state, and plan, for the latter are the products of dominant economic, social, and political relationships. And that's the end of the chapter. Thank you so much for listening.